Hello there. So I've had a Mazda 6 for just over 2 years. I bought it in January 2020. I bought a Mazda 6 2016 with about 35,000 miles on the clock for about £12,000 at the time. Traded in my old Jaguar X-Type, very sad to see that go. But I had this Mazda 6 and my first impressions were it's amazing. It's a great sort of executive car, whatever that means. Just a saloon that's quite attractive with a lot of gadgets and things in it. Now, I made a few videos about the pros and cons of that car. Having reached the kind of 2-year milestone, I have actually received some requests to do an update. So based on that, I'm going to give you in this video the top 5 worst and best features of owning the car in those last 2 years, and there have been updates probably within the last couple of weeks actually on this list. And I'm going to end by sort of talking about, well, where we go from here. Am I going to keep the car or do I want a new car? And if I do, what car do I want next? And I think that's going to be quite an interesting thing, and I'd be really interested actually to have your opinion on what I should do. So without any further ado, let's actually get on with the list. So we'll go through the top 5 worst things to start with. Now, all of these things are electrical gremlins. The electronics in this car is amazing value for money. You get things like a heads-up display, heated seats, heated electric seats, blind spot monitoring, distance keeping and alertness monitoring, and all these fancy features in this car. And it's a bit of a cliche. Whenever you mention electrical features to people, they always say, oh, more things to go wrong. Well, do you know what? They're actually right. So let me go through this top 5 list and talk a little bit about each of those. So firstly, the reverse camera freaks out when it gets hot. Now, this is a really weird and annoying and frustrating thing that happens. Most of the time, the reverse camera is a godsend. People say you can kind of be too reliant on these electronic aids. Yeah, you can become too reliant in the sense that when it breaks, what do? You're reliant on your own rubbish abilities. But actually, I think that the reverse camera is just a fantastic thing I would never do without. So I really like it. But whenever the car gets hot, and it is only whenever the car gets hot, the camera really freaks out and basically it becomes unusable. The image starts cycling a bit like a television, an analog television that's not tuned in properly. Somebody who claimed to be a sort of Mazda engineer said that basically the wiring harness or the camera needs replacing. That may well be right, but I'd be interested to know if any of you have got a problem with the reversing camera, or is this something that I can fix myself? If I go to a Mazda garage and ask them to replace that, I shouldn't think I'd have much change out of £700 to £1,000. So the first item on the list was, it's annoying, but it's sporadic. The second item on the list is the automatic locking, which I really should get around to disabling because honestly, it raises my blood pressure in a way that probably isn't healthy. So the car has got this great feature where you walk away from the car, it locks itself so you don't remember to have to lock it with the key fob. Great, we're living in the future. But it is far too overzealous. And actually, I can get out of the car, walk to the back door, and the car locks itself. And certainly, if I walk to like the boot, the car will lock itself. It locks itself while it's got passengers still in it. I've even changed the battery in the key fob, which is what everybody said was the fault, but it still does it. It is just really annoying. Now, interestingly, there is actually another fault with the locking, which is equally and kind of more dangerously annoying, which is that, okay, most of the time it locks itself when all I've done is even looked out the window. It's like, you've left, I'll lock it. But it also sometimes doesn't lock at all. And it doesn't have a kind of timer like I think maybe my old Rover had, where you kind of left it for a while and it would lock itself automatically, so it wasn't left unlocked for the whole time. Well, this, I've come back a day later and the car's been unlocked for 2 days. Not very helpful. So the third item on this list is the GPS, which is only a problem when I go on any journeys and I don't know my way around. Stick on the GPS and there are some very annoying faults with mine. Now, the first is probably actually a problem with my GPS antenna, probably unique to me. essentially it just, sometimes it takes ages to lock onto the GPS satellites, and it'll have me driving on parallel roads to the road I'm actually driving on. And the most annoying and frustrating thing is going round roundabouts. It updates long after I've actually gone round the roundabout, so I can be driving off down a road thinking, yeah, this is probably the exit it means, and it's kind of still watching me go round the roundabout, which is really, really quite frustrating and dangerous when you are trying to kind of get to your destination. But there are some other problems with the GPS as well. There have been a couple of times where I put in addresses in my local city and thought, okay, yeah, must know what it's doing, so I'll follow it. And it's taken me to completely the wrong location. It's taken me to like basically the centre of the city, despite definitely putting in the address. So I don't know what that's about. There's another weird fault where it doesn't recognise all the numbers on a road. So you put in a postcode and you know the person's house number. And in fact, I did this like last week, and it's like, no, that house number doesn't exist. Well, I'm pretty sure it does exist. So that's quite frustrating. There's also another thing. This is just a bug. I just did a long journey the other day, and it was adding like an hour and a half to my journey time for no apparent reason. And by itself, not a problem, but when added to all of these GPS faults that I've got, really quite frustrating. And also on that long journey that I just did, I had 2 warnings come up on my dashboard, seemingly simultaneously, quite alerting, and again, I think quite dangerous. Bit like speed cameras. You know how you see a speed camera and it makes you check your speedometer, and that's kind of a bit dangerous because you should just be looking at the road. Now, before you all say, well, you should be doing the speed limit. I'm afraid it's a reaction. You could do the speed limit all the time, but if you see a speed camera, you are going to check your speedometer and panic a little bit, just in case, because who wants a fine? I got a couple of really loud alarms, and one of them was tyre pressure, which instantly makes you think, have I got a blown out tyre? What's going on? Then I got this BSM warning, blind spot monitoring system. So essentially, when a car comes up either side of you, you're supposed to get a little light on the wing mirrors that tells you that there's a car in your blind spot, so don't pull out, so it's a good safety feature. But apparently that was malfunctioning. Both of these things about 70 miles into a 90-mile journey. Makes you worry, makes you probably drive less safely than had the stupid errors not come up. Now, interestingly, since that long journey, I checked the tyre pressures. They're absolutely fine. Reset the warning. I haven't got a slow puncture. And the warning light hasn't come on anymore. And with the blind spot monitoring, that error's also disappeared. And I've driven on roads where I've had people undertaking me and overtaking me, and the blind spot monitoring has worked properly. So it just seems that long journeys on hot roads, because it was probably 20 degrees Celsius or something on the road, and these things just kind of go wrong. So I've just realised I've combined 4 and 5 there, the blind spot monitoring and the tyre pressure, but that's fine. Who's counting? Well, I'm counting, and you're counting. So despite all of that moaning about technological gremlins in the car, there are still, I do still love the car, and there are a number of things that I particularly love about the car. So let's go through that list. So firstly, related to that first list, and I alluded to this earlier, but I've had this car now for nearly 2.5 years, and not a single mechanical fault has occurred on the car. Sure, I've had to have some tyres. That's not mechanical. That's a wear and tear issue, in my opinion. You get that on any car. But this is the only car that I've ever owned, and I've had probably 4 or 5 cars now in my lifetime. And to be honest, they've all come off the forecourt and needed probably £500 to £1,000 worth of work doing to them. This is really unusual for me to have a car for this amount of time that's been so reliable. And presumably that's because it's Japanese and they are renowned for making very reliable cars. Now, number 2, the car still does look great. I do like the look of this car a lot. I prefer the red colour, as I've mentioned a few times. Still not bitter about that, but I couldn't at the time get the spec that I wanted, but I just think it's got quite an imposing look. I prefer the sort of long saloon look to the SUV type vehicles that a lot of people drive nowadays. And to be honest, this market of executive saloons is sort of shrinking a bit, unless you want like a BMW, an Audi. Well, actually now I say it, there's quite a few. But I think that the interior and the exterior of the Mazda 6 is kind of classy, and there's a considered, consistent style throughout the car, which I appreciate. Maybe I'm just weird. I think it's a nice looking car. Now, this is going to make me sound like a boy racer, but it accelerates quickly. So essentially, like any diesel, you can do this sort of kick down thing where you put your foot to the floor, you press a sort of button in your diesel car. I only found this out actually about 2 years ago, but once you put your foot to the floor, you can push it a little bit further, and there's like a button, and that's this overdrive thing, I think it's called. The car really does have some grunt, and it sounds great as well. Now, obviously, it markets itself as a sports car. It's not a sports car. Most cars that market themselves as sports cars aren't sports cars, but it sounds pretty good to my kind of amateur ear, and it does accelerate pretty well, better than any car I've ever owned, and certainly better than any diesel car that I've driven. Now, on that long journey that I just did, the car actually was extremely fuel efficient. I got something like 45 miles to the gallon. I probably could have got more if I'd driven more carefully. A lot of you with Mazda 6s will tell me you can, frequently get into the 50s, and you can if you are doing long journeys. In the city, if I'm driving like a sort of, pensioner essentially, I can get, late 30s miles to the gallon. But typically, we're talking mid-30s really. And if I'm driving really kind of aggressively and having to stop at a lot of traffic lights, we're talking more like 33 miles to the gallon. Yeah, I was happy. I was pleased and relieved to go on a long journey and actually get a decent fuel economy out of the car, because we know that, diesel's so expensive at the moment. That brings me on to the next point I'm going to make. So it turns out, although I've said this is the top 5, it turns out I had 4 items for the best list and 4 items for the worst list, which shows that basically I didn't prepare this video properly, so sorry about that. I don't really care. 4 is probably enough. Video's long enough. Really, this brings me on to my next point, which is, what I intend to do next. So I've had this car now, as I say, for 2.5 years. Nothing's gone wrong, which is fantastic. It's probably going to go wrong soon. I'm probably not going to get rid of the car before something does go wrong. Essentially, what I'm kind of getting to now is, what is the next car that I want? And really, I want an electric car. To be honest, I'm sick of going to petrol stations in this country, in the UK, whenever there's any sort of slight talk of fuel shortages, or even if they mention the word diesel or petrol on the news, they just kind of flock to the petrol stations and queue outside and drain the petrol stations, and then it's difficult to get hold of the fuel. Fuel rockets up in price, as it has because of reasons we all know about at the moment. It's now, I'm paying basically, the most I've paid now is £2 for a litre of V-Power diesel. I do put the V-Power diesel in my car, or any premium diesel actually in my car, because it produces less soot. I've heard it from many mechanics that you should really put the premium diesel in a car if you want it to go, if you want it to last. And it does actually feel a little bit more responsive when you use the premium stuff as well. So I do rate it. To be honest, it's like 10p more a litre or something. It's not absolutely absurd. Just generally, the price of fuel is absurd. £2 a litre. And I'm sort of thinking to myself, if I had an electric car, I'd be saving myself, and this, brace yourself, but I'd probably be saving myself about £2,500 a year. I spend that much on fuel because I do like driving. I have to drive a lot for various reasons. And I sort of feel like I could instantly save that amount by getting a small electric car. Now, therein lies the first problem. I've been driving large saloons for a long time. They're practical because you can put the seats down generally. It's more comfortable generally on long journeys especially, and you tend to get a lot of gadgets and gizmos on these kind of executive level cars. So I would miss that in an electric car, but I really like the idea of sort of saving quite a lot of money on fuel. Now, the other problem, my budget basically would probably be about 12 grand for the car. I could spend more if I was to take out credit. I'm not a great fan of credit for cars, mainly because I've never done it before. I've never taken out credit like that. And when you look at that price range, it's really quite limiting. So you've basically got the Nissan Leaf, the Renault Zoe, and I think maybe there's a Volkswagen car as well. Now, the advertised ranges for those cars can be as much as sort of 200 miles, but if you actually look at the real ranges for those cars in kind of normal driving conditions, you're talking about half that. You're talking about 100 miles. Now, for pottering around the town, perfect. You know, going out the weekend, probably perfect. But any sort of long journey at all, and you are going to have to factor in a stop for an extended period to charge your car. And that kind of worries me, you know, because generally you know that there's going to be a petrol station somewhere, and I just think there's less infrastructure in place for the electric cars. And I've watched enough videos and things where I've seen people kind of struggling to find charging points and stuff, and that's not a hassle that I'm interested in at the moment. I also think adding that extra time to your journey and stuff, I would do it if I had to, for the convenience of saving the money, but that seemed a little bit off-putting as well. Now there's a third thing, which is that for the kind of price range I'm looking at, you won't get a new car for that, obviously. I've never bought a new car and I'm unlikely to buy a new car. You're only going to get a sort of 2016 aged electric car, which isn't old. My car is 2016. It is fairly new. The problem is these electric cars that I've been looking at, each, you know, they've done like 30,000 miles and they've got like 3 owners. Well, why is that? Why are people so put off by these cars? Is it the short range? Is it because the batteries easily kind of degrade in their maximum charging capacity? Because I tell you, if you bought a cheap electric car and it turned out the batteries were naff, you could probably think about paying another $4,000 to have the batteries replaced. So I'm kind of put off by that. And so basically, all of those issues sort of make me feel like I'm not ready to get an electric car. And I need to think about kind of waiting a few years until the current generation of electric cars come down in price. And hopefully the batteries won't be knackered on those. I mean, as a little aside, I do rather feel as if the car buying market is trying to evolve itself. I think the manufacturers are trying to steer it, no pun intended, towards a kind of credit-only situation where cars are so expensive, you know, like 40, 50 grand, that you'd have to be a millionaire to want to buy that in cash. And even then, there's a kind of argument that you wouldn't deprive yourself of 50k. You could invest that somewhere and borrow it more cheaply or something. But I think they kind of want people to buy these expensive cars and buy them on credit. I've got these kind of multiple barriers to overcome: the credit, the reliability of the batteries, the range of the cars, the convenience of them, before I can actually kind of make the jump. Now, Ellie made a suggestion the other week, actually, which was quite good, which was, you know, well, why don't you just get a car for kind of little journeys, you know, going across the city or whatever, which isn't a bad idea, actually. And then you might find that you build the confidence to go further and invest in the technology more. So I don't know, we'll see. But notice how I'm not thinking of an executive car in the future. I am kind of resigned to the fact that my next car will be electric, because there's too much to be saved by getting an electric car. Of course, I want a Tesla, by the way, but, you know, they're just too expensive. Anyway, that's just my kind of thoughts, my rambling about the good and bad parts of the Mazda 6. If you've got a Mazda 6 and you've got similar things, or maybe you think I've missed something off these lists, do let me know down below. I'll be interested to hear it. Thank you, by the way, to my loyal patrons who are scrolling down the screen now, especially George Foot, Magnanimous Meg, Jennifer Jones and Rob Van Eden, who are extremely generous patrons. Thank you very much indeed. That's it. I'll see you next time. For another video.